Hi, everyone. So this is part two of our first lecture from January 29th. And let me share my screen with you. So the last lecture, the first part of the first lecture, we talked about geology. And now we're going to talk about exploration and the founding of the colony of New Amsterdam. So let's talk a little bit about European exploration of North America. So we're going back to the earliest history of New York City here, just for a little bit. There are a couple explorers that I want you to know about. The first one is Giovanni di Verrazzano. The Verrazzano Bridge is named after him, connecting Brooklyn and Staten Island. Excuse me. The bridge, curiously, is missing one of the Z's in Verrazzano's last name. They misspelled the name of the bridge. I can't tell you why. But Verrazzano was an explorer, working in 1524. And he was an Italian, but he was working for the French government. And his ship was named the Dauphine. So Verrazzano, there's a journal of ship's log has survived of his voyage. He poked along the East Coast very carefully and slowly, and he did enter the lower bay of what is now New York. And he anchored off of Staten Island. So he got pretty close, but he never actually went into the upper harbor and apparently never set foot on Manhattan. But he did meet some of the local Native Americans, and but then apparently a storm came up and he had to weigh anchor and go back out to sea. And then once he was back out at sea, he decided to keep going. And so he never actually went into the upper harbor. But so that was 1524. So then much later, Henry Hudson is an English explorer, and he was working for the Dutch East India Company, which was kind of like a semi-public corporation that was set up to exploit resources. And Hudson undertakes a series of voyages. This is much later than Verrazzano. This is the main one that we're interested in was 1609. So much later, almost a century after Verrazzano. This is his ship, or this is a recreation of his ship called the Half Moon. You can see it's really extremely tiny ship. You can see the guy up there in the crow's nest. If you see that, to get an idea of the size of the ship, it's really, really small. So they undertake this voyage in 1609 on the Half Moon, and he was looking for something called the Northwest Passage. He was being sent out by the Dutch East India Company to look for trade routes to the Pacific and to where they were primarily interested in a way to get to China and India. Those were markets that they were already exploiting. They didn't know at this point really about North America or how big it was. They knew that there was land there because people had been fishing off of the east coast of North America already, and Verrazzano had been there and seen it. But they didn't realize that there was an entire continent between them and the Pacific Ocean. So they had this idea of taking a shortcut to the trade markets, and this became this mythology of the so-called Northwest Passage. So other people had looked for it, and Hudson was looking for the same thing. So this is looking down on the Earth from above the Arctic Circle. So let me see if I can draw on this. There we go. So let's see. So Hudson starts over here. Here's Holland, and he goes down here. And what he pokes along the East Coast, and then he gets to New York. And he actually does go into the harbor. He sees Manhattan. He meets the local Native Americans. He discovers a river that we now call the Hudson River, and he goes as far north as Albany. So he actually goes up the river. But he was primarily interested in finding a way through, oops, I didn't mean to do that, trying to find a way through up and over North America so that they could come out in the Pacific Ocean. But of course, this entire region here, the Arctic Circle, was all frozen, so that didn't work. So, but that's the idea. They're trying to figure out a way. So he's, God, I can't control this pen here. So he's on the East Coast, and they're poking along, trying to get through, trying to find a way through the continent. Eventually, Hudson does end up finding what is now Hudson Bay, and that's where he dies. His crew mutinies on a later voyage, leaves him there to die, the frozen wasteland of the Hudson Bay. So, but going back to 1609, Hudson does find what became Manhattan in the Hudson River. Oops, sorry, I can't see. Oh, there we go. Ah. Great. Okay, so he goes back to Holland, and he tells them, well, tells the directors of the Dutch East India Company, well, I didn't find the Northwest Passage, but I did find this place with a really sheltered harbor, and what I noticed is that there are people living there, and they're willing to trade beaver skins, and there's lots of trees there, so there's lots of lumber. And this was very interesting to the directors of the Dutch East India Company, because while they didn't find the Northwest Passage, they did find something that's really just as good, which is they found this untouched landscape, untouched continent that's full of huge trees that they can cut down and use for lumber, and it's full of beaver, mink, otter, other animals that were fur-producing animals that could be skinned and used for making hats out of and things like that. So those two commodities were in really short supply in Europe at that point. Europe at that point had been pretty much deforested, and so it was really unusual to find any growth of old trees that are big enough to build ships with. And that was the big attraction of lumber, is that they could build ships with them. So they needed big trees like oak trees, really old big trees. And of course, there was lots of those around what became, in the area that became New York. And they're also just crawling with animals that they could, kill and skin and make stuff out of. So those were really, especially the beaver, like everybody wanted a beaver hat in Europe at that point, but beaver had been eradicated from Europe. So this was like a gold mine that Hudson had found just kind of by accident. And so the Dutch East India Company then forms an offshoot, which is called the Dutch West India Company. And this is chartered in 1621. So quite a few years after Hudson's initial voyage. And the Dutch West India Company, again, is it's a private corporation, but working with the Dutch government. So kind of semi-public, semi-private. One analogy that I've heard is it's like Walmart, but with its own navy. You know, it's like basically like a big global, or Amazon, but with its own navy. Actually, Amazon may have its own navy at this point. It's kind of like that, like a global trading empire that has ambitions for cornering every corner of the globe. So they decide that they're going to start a colony in the New World, and they're going to call it, obviously, New Netherland. And New Netherland ends up lasting from 1624 to 1664. And this is where it was. So let me see if I can draw again. Having problems with the drawing. So this was New Netherland. So this entire thing in the Hudson River Valley right here is New Netherland. New Amsterdam, this is New York, what became New York City right here. New Amsterdam, which you can see here, was founded at the tip of Manhattan as the capital of New Netherland. So one thing that you should distinguish is between New Netherland, which is the overall colony, and New Amsterdam, which is the capital, the primary settlement of the New Netherland colony. And you can see that it encompasses not only what is today New York City, but much of New York State, and also all of what is today New Jersey. So it goes all the way down to the Delaware River. And then you can also see, oops, down here is the Virginia colony, which had been founded a little bit earlier. And then all the way down here is Spanish Florida, New Spain. There are also French settlements and Swedish settlements. So there were a lot of settlements by this point, including up here in New England, where you have the famous Plymouth colony, which was founded in 1620, and the Boston colony in Salem. So the eastern seaboard of North America in the 1620s is getting more and more European settlement. So I already said that. That was the two reasons why they founded the colony: animal pelts and timber for shipbuilding. And New Amsterdam, again, was the primary settlement of the New Netherland colony. And this is a depiction of what it probably looked like. So 1624 is when the first settlers arrive. They were not, curiously, Dutch. They were Belgians. There were refugees that were from Wallonia, so they're called Walloons, which is part of Belgium. And they had gone to the Netherlands, to Holland, because they were being persecuted by the Spanish. So they were refugees and therefore desperate, and so they signed on when the Dutch West India Company asked if anybody wanted to go settle in the New World, which at the time was just crazy. I mean, it was like if the government today asked for volunteers to go colonize Mars, you know, some people would do it, definitely, but the chances are you were not coming back to Europe, that it was a one-way trip. You were going to go over there and take your chances in what was a wilderness. And with minimal supplies, they would send them periodic supply ships one of the very first ships that went over with them carried goats and pigs and cows. But the supply ships were very few and far between. So they were basically on their own. And it was just a few families, like a few dozen families and single people that came over. At first, they settled on what is today called Governor's Island in the harbor, and then made the fateful decision to move to the tip of Manhattan. So that's the first European settlement in Manhattan is shortly after the first families arrive. So skipping ahead a little bit, so there was a series of governors of this tiny colony that was known as New Amsterdam. None of them lasted very long. They were called director generals. That's the leaders of these colonies, of the colony. And by 1626, they'd already gone through 2 or 3 director generals, and this guy, Peter Minuit, becomes the director general. And he's famous because he was the one who bought Manhattan from the local Native Americans, the Lenape. And of course, this is a story that I'm sure you've heard in grade school, that they bought it for next to nothing, and that the Lenape were crazy to sell Manhattan to the Dutch for so little money. 60 guilders, what the guilders were the Dutch currency. Seems crazy. But for the Lenape at that point, we're going to talk about the Lenape a little bit more in a minute. For the Lenape, it wasn't the money. The money was given in the form of these commodities that they didn't have. So hatchets, they didn't have hatchets. They're extremely useful for cutting down trees and making fires and making their architecture, which I'll show you in a second. The hatchets were iron. The Lenape didn't have iron. So where were they going to get hatchets? I mean, so they had tons of land. So a trade for a bit of their land, which ended up being Manhattan and the most valuable real estate on earth, made sense actually in the context of that time period. And blankets, they didn't have wool blankets. They didn't have any sheep. So wool blankets were incredible to them. And the beads, I mean, they didn't have anything like that either. They used shells for trading as a currency called wampum, but the beads were interesting too. So it made sense that they would make that trade. The other thing, well, we're going to talk more about the Lenape, but the Lenape also saw this transaction a little differently than the Dutch did. The Dutch saw this as a real estate deal, right? So we're buying land from you, you get something and we get the land in return. And our ideas, as Americans, our ideas come down from the European idea that the Dutch had, which is that you buy land and it's private. You buy land and you're allowed to put a fence around it or whatever. But the Lenape didn't have that kind of, none of the North American Indians had that idea of land ownership, not just the Lenape, but the Iroquois and the New England Indians that didn't understand this at all. So their idea of land ownership was that you're asking to use the land. Everything was shared. The idea that you would own land and not let somebody else use it they didn't understand that at all. So this was a cultural difference which led to a lot of problems and ultimately to a lot of conflict between the Dutch and the Lenape. But at first, when the Lenape met the Dutch, they were very fond of the Dutch. I mean, they by all accounts, they brought them things and they seemed nice and they seemed pretty harmless, really. The Dutch were much shorter than the Lenape. The Lenape were a very tall people. The Dutch were not as tall. So the Dutch weren't threatening in any way to the Lenape. The Lenape were in control. And at first it was just a few families. So no reason to worry, right? I mean, everything will be fine. But the Dutch were very suspicious of Lenape culture because they were so different and they didn't wear clothes, as many clothes the way that the Dutch did. And they moved around, they didn't have fixed addresses. They would do things like make red paint out of berries and paint their face. The Dutch thought that was really strange. And the Lenape thought the Dutch were strange too, because they're wearing all these clothes in the summertime. And so there was a lot of differences in their culture, and also language, of course. They couldn't understand each other. Curiously, as often happens, right, the Dutch children and the Lenape children got along great. And the Dutch children started learning the Lenape language and vice versa right away, because children can learn language in a way that adults can't. But they were crucial, the Lenape were crucial to the Dutch's chances of survival, because the Lenape were the providers of these commodities that the Dutch needed, especially the beaver skins. So the tip of Manhattan, which you can see here, there's a fort, there's a windmill, there's a few scattered houses, that becomes a merchandise mart, a trading point between the Dutch and the Lenape. And that was the sole purpose of the New Netherland colony. So Lenape just means the people in their idea of themselves, the people. And they were part of a larger Native American tribe called the Delaware that went all the way down to present day Delaware. And they spoke a language that a lot of different dialects, but there was the Delaware language, and then Munsee was the local dialect that the Lenape spoke in and around present day New York. And this is a depiction of one of the Lenape, just so you can kind of see how they looked. This guy is wearing a flying squirrel pelt around his neck that's been made into a pouch for a pipe. Kind of cool. And he has a blanket over his shoulders that might have been one of the wool blankets that the Dutch brought over. And they had architecture. The Lenape, they used a type of architecture called the longhouse, which all the New England Indians used. And it was a really ingenious structure. It was made with poles that were saplings that were cut when they were green, so they're bendable. And so that you can see the ceiling there is tensile members bent over and held in place, tied. And then they have vertical columns, are also poles that they cut down. And then the outer skin of it is bark. And this is on the right, here's a modern recreation of a longhouse. And on the drawing on the left, you can see, let's see. You can see that they would build fires and they would have chimneys so that the smoke could get out. Here's a chimney. So that's how they stayed warm. And it was just a simple hole in the roof with a fire down below. And then you can see here that they would sleep on platforms above the ground. Here you can see them over here. So they're not sleeping on the ground. And here you can see the fire and the hole above that let the smoke out. And the cool thing about these was that they were temporary structures. The Lenape would not live in a place in the same spot for years and years. They would take these apart and save the poles, sometimes save the poles, and then they could transport them and build them somewhere else. So the Lenape, in terms of the way that they used land use, in terms of the way they used the land in Manhattan, this was also something that was very strange to the Dutch, because the Lenape didn't have an idea of fixed settlements. They were seasonal. So in the summer, they would be in Manhattan because they would use it for hunting and fishing. And they would, in the spring, they would plant their crops, and then they would live there over the summer, and then in the fall they would harvest, and then after the harvest they would pack up their things and they would move for the winter further inland where they were less exposed, and they could hunker down in the woods or in valleys of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and spend the winter there, and then they would come back in the spring and replant their farms in Manhattan. So at times in the winter, Manhattan was deserted because the Lenape would leave. And the Dutch didn't understand why they did this, because the Dutch had this European idea that you put down roots, you found a colony, it lasts for centuries, etc. So this is very strange to the Dutch. So speaking of farming, so the Lenape were expert farmers, and a lot of big areas of Manhattan were given over to farmland. And that meant that when the Dutch came over, Manhattan was not a wilderness. It was not a wilderness. It wasn't heavily wooded. There were trees, but the big trees tended to be more like in New Jersey and in Brooklyn, and what became Brooklyn, like the outlying areas. And there were lots of trees on Manhattan too, but it wasn't like a forest. It was a lot of it was given over to farmland. So the Lenape had cut trees to clear land for farming, and also trees to build fires with. So they really used a lot of trees they burned a lot of trees for fires to keep warm. So they had a division of labor according to gender. So the women would do the farming. So the women were the expert farmers, not the men. The women were. And the men would hunt and fish. And there was great fishing around Manhattan at that point. Amazing. You had like the striped bass coming through once a year, as they still do. But you also had majestic oyster beds right around Manhattan. Incredible oysters, huge oysters. And at this point, there were still like bears in and around Manhattan, and wolves and things like that, and deer. So the men took care of the hunting and the fishing. The women took care of the farming. So again, this was a perception, this led to a perception by the Dutch that Lenape men were lazy, because Europeans, the men do the farming, and the women traditionally took care of the house and the children and helped with the farming. But the men, it was like really a man's duty to be the farmer in Europe. So they saw the Lenape men to them, it looked like they were just hanging around, but in fact, they were hard at work. But the Dutch thought of fishing as being more like a hobby. So they saw the men fishing and they thought, oh, the Lenape men are so lazy. Look at them, they're making the women do all the farming. But in fact, the Lenape men worked really hard. I mean, they made these fishing baskets that were called weirs that they would set up to trap fish. And they spent a lot of time hunting and fishing. So the farming that the Lenape women did was a real particular type of farming called companion farming, which is really ingenious and way ahead of its time. And their three main crops were nicknamed the Three Sisters. And those three crops were corn, beans, and squash. And those were their principal three crops that they raised. And it was called companion farming because each of the three crops relies on the other for something. So the corn, which grows very tall and has a strong structure, provides something for the beans to climb on. The beans in turn provide nitrogen to the soil to enrich the soil. And then the squash spread along the ground. So they crowd out weeds, and they also provide shade for the beans with their leaves. So it's really, really cool the way that they all work together. This is something you may have learned in grade school. So, but yeah, so they were expert farmers. Oh, this slide is out of place. This is Peter Minuit. I meant to show you this earlier. Anyway, doesn't matter. That's what he looked like. So the first reading you're doing, let's talk about that a little bit. You're reading Manhattan in maps, and we're looking at some of the earliest maps of New York. And the first one is called the Manatus map. So Manatus, as you'll find out in the reading, is an archaic spelling of the word that eventually became Manahatta and then Manhattan. And this is the earliest known map of Manatus Island, which was produced in 1639. So 15 years after the founding of New Amsterdam. So here's Manhattan in the middle. Up here is the present day Bronx. This is present day Queens over here, present day Brooklyn down here. This is all New Jersey over here. This is Governor's Island down here. Staten Island we can't see. And then this is the East River. And then this is the Hudson River up here. Of course, they continue. This continues to Long Island, the East River, and the Hudson River, of course, goes all the way up to Canada. So you'll see on here, this is Dutch, and it's labeled North River. So the North River was the first name for what the river that became Hudson's River, the Hudson River. And it was called the North River because it was in the larger colony that went all the way down to Delaware. The Delaware River was considered the South River. The Hudson River was considered the North River. So that's what they called it at that point. And eventually everybody started calling it Hudson River, as we do today. But there are still people in New York who will call it the North River. Apparently there are, especially tugboat captains around New York will still refer to it as the North River. Sometimes the slide changes and sometimes it doesn't. Oh, there we go. So in the reading, you'll see that there is, that it's a really cool map, and there's a key. And so there are things there. Let me go back to, there are numbers and letters on the map. And then there's a helpful key that comes with it, just like a modern map. And it's in Dutch, but that's okay because we can figure it out. It's not that hard to figure out. So this is all explained in the reading in more detail than I'm going into now. But I just wanted to show you this because it's really cool. So most of these, you'll see the word Bowery repeated a lot, and that Bowery was Dutch for farm. And I can't pronounce this word, but plantage or something. And this is Old Dutch, not just Dutch, but Old Dutch. So that's like Dutch for plantation. So so all of this stuff here is like, there are names listed. So it's, most of the numbers on the map are related to who owned which farm. Makes sense. Because at this point, then the Dutch were copying the Lenape and they were farming Manhattan. 1639. But then over here, I want you to see that there's a few letters as well. There's A, B, C, D, F. There's no E. I don't know why there's no E. But A is Fort Amsterdam. That's on the map. And then there are 3 windmills. So the windmills, you know, the Dutch really good at harnessing wind energy. So they were building windmills back home in Holland. So they built them here. Why? Well, they were power. That's how they got power. So they had to cut down trees and plane the trees into lumber. And they did that. The sawmill was powered by wind. So they had windmills. And then this is down here, which is F, is significant and disturbing because you can see it says in Dutch, and I'm paraphrasing, the quarters of the slaves. So that's where the slaves lived. So yes, the Dutch did bring over slaves. Most of them were from Angola and Africa and areas around there, the Congo, but a lot of slaves came over from Angola. And so from the very beginning of New York, it was exploiting slave labor from Africa. This gets to be much more of a important, critical part of New York's development once the British take over, which we'll talk about later. But the Dutch did own slaves, and they had some, compared to later times, these African slaves did have some basic rights. They had the right of assembly, they could own their own property, they could live apart from their owner, but still, these were enslaved people abducted from Africa and taken against their will to the New World. So that story is embedded in the early story of New York. Sorry, my cursor disappears sometimes for mysterious reasons. Now it's completely disappeared. Bear with me here. Nope. Seems to be, oh, there we go. It's got a mind of its own. So, New York has a reputation as a melting pot, attracting cultures from all over the world. Interestingly, that quality was there from the very beginning of New Amsterdam. So there were people coming, initially it was Belgian refugees, and then the Dutch were coming over with slaves, but then it became, since it was a point of trade, it was becoming a place to do business. So New Amsterdam was always just a place to do business. It was never, wasn't founded for any reasons other than commercial enterprise. Unlike, say, the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, which was founded because they wanted freedom of religion, the Dutch were just in it for the money. And that's why New Amsterdam was founded. So curiously, the idea that New Yorkers are obsessed with making money, New Yorkers have that reputation that they just want to do business, make a deal, that was there from the very beginning. So it was attracting people from all over the world. And even when it was just tiny, like a few thousand people, there were already people from all over the world. So there were people from the Netherlands, obviously, Dutch people, African slaves, but there were English, Swedish, Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish. They were all coming over to try to make a living in this new place. So you can imagine that there were so many different languages spoken in New Amsterdam at the time. So there was Dutch, which was Old Dutch, which is an archaic form of modern Dutch. There was English, There was Swedish, there was Bantu, which is the language of the sub-Saharan African people, Angola, Congo, etc. And Bantu includes a lot of languages and dialects in it. Portuguese, Spanish, Hebrew. There were Sephardic Jews coming over by way of Brazil as refugees to New Amsterdam. There were Germans, there were French, Italian was spoken, and then Munsee, which was the dialect of the Lenape. So the trading relationship between the Dutch and the Lenape was very profitable for both of them for a while. But this cultural disagreement over land ownership led to conflict. And there was a succession of director generals that were kind of cycled in and out of the colony. Then they would be recalled to Holland. And one of these was named, I'm afraid I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's Willem Kieft, I think, but it might be Keft. Let's call him Kieft. So he came over in 1638. So around the time the Manatus map was drawn. And he did a lot of good things. He gave a lot of farmland to slaves and things like that. But he exploited a disagreement with the Lenape over land use that apparently originated in a Lenape woman, I think, entering a Dutch peach orchard and taking some peaches. And this was used as a kind of excuse to start a conflict with the Lenape. So they called that part of it the Peach War. And this blew up into a wider conflict and that Kieft exploited. He was trying to form trading relationships with the Iroquois further to the north. And so he decided that the Lenape were expendable and that they should be eliminated. And this was the first example of genocide, really, in the New World. And in 1643, Kieft orders Dutch troops to go over to New Jersey to a settlement called Pavonia. And they massacred innocent Lenape men, women, and children. And then this led to a wider conflict, which was nicknamed Kieft's War, which ended up spreading all the way to Connecticut and lasted for 2 years and killed about, rough estimate, about 800 Lenape people. So when that happened, the relationship between the Dutch and the Lenape was injured, to say the least. Not completely dead, but pretty much. And the Lenape people their presence gradually faded away around Manhattan and environs. And this map is showing where they went over the next 200 years. The kind of gradual exodus of Lenape away from New York into upstate New York, into Pennsylvania, and then just further and further west. You know, the same old story of gradually removing Native American people as more and more of the eastern United States was settled by people of European ancestry. So the Lenape were kind of pushed gradually to Ohio, and then further and further west and south. And there's still communities of Lenape today. I think the main one today is in Oklahoma. Okay, so we're gonna stop there. That's part 2 of lecture 1. That explains a little bit about the reading that you're doing in Manhattan and Maps, at least the Manatus map part of it. And next week, we're gonna talk about the other maps that are covered in that reading. And then I will see you next week for another live lecture and then another part 2 recorded lecture, and this is the way we're going to try to do it. And thanks for listening. See you later.